Hello, guys. Welcome to Reading War and Peace. And continuing where I left off, chapter 13. Soon after Christmas time, Nikolai told his mother about his love for Sonia and his firm decision to marry her. The Countess, who had long noticed what was happening between Sonia and Nikolai and had been expecting this talk, listened silently to his words and said to her soon that he could carry whomever he wanted, but that neither she nor his father would give their blessings to such a marriage. For the first time, Nikolai felt that his mother was displeased with him, and that despite all her love for him, she would not yield. Coldly, and without looking at her son, she sent for her husband. And when he came, the Countess was going to tell him, briefly and coldly, in Nikolai's presence, what the matter was, but she could not stand it. She wept tears of vexation and left the room. The old count began hesitantly to admonish Nikolai and beg him to renounce his intention. Nikolai replied that he could not go back on his word, and his father sighed and, obviously embarrassed, very quickly broke off their talk and went to the Countess. In all his confrontations with his son, the Count had always been aware of his guilt before him for this disorder of his affairs, and therefore he could not be angry with his son for his refusal to marry a rich bride and his choice of the dowerless Sonia. He only remembered more vividly that if their affairs had not been in disorder, they could not have hoped for a better wife for Nikolai than Sonia, and that he alone, with his Mitenka and his insuperable habits, was to blame for the disorder of their affairs. The father and mother spoke no further with their son about this matter, but several days later the Countess summoned Sonia to her, and with a cruelty neither of them expected, reproached her niece for luring her son away and for ingratitude. Sonia listened to the Countess's cruel words silently, with lowered eyes, and did not understand what was being demanded of her. She was ready to sacrifice everything for her benefactors. The thought of self-sacrifice was her favorite thought. But in this case, she could not understand to whom and what she must sacrifice. She could not help loving the Countess and the whole Rostov family, but neither could she help loving Nikolai and knowing what his happiness depended on that love. She was silent and sad and made no reply. Nikolai, as it seemed to him, could not bear this situation any longer and went to talk with his mother. Nikolai first begged his mother to forgive him and Sonia and agreed to the marriage, then threatened his mother that if Sonia was persecuted, he would secretly marry her at once. The Countess, with a coldness such as her son had never seen, replied to him that he was of age, that Prince Andrei was going to marry without his father's consent, and that he could do the same, but that she would never recognize this intriguer as her daughter. At the word intriguer, Nikolai exploded, raised his voice, and said to his mother that he had never thought she would make him sell his feelings, and that if it was so, he was saying for the last time. But he had no time to say the decisive word, which, judging by the expression on her face, his mother anticipated with horror, and which might have remained a bitter memory between them forever. He had no time to finish, because Natasha, with a pale and serious face, came into the room from the door behind which she had been eavesdropping. "Nicolenta, you're talking nonsense. Keep quiet, keep quiet. Keep quiet, I tell you," she almost shouted in order to drown out his voice. "Mamma, darling, it's not at all because... My poor, dear heart," she was saying to her mother, who, feeling herself on the verge of a breakup, looked at her son with horror, but, stubborn and carried away by the struggle, would not and could not give in. "Nicolenta, I'll explain. You just go." "Listen, Mamma, darling," she said to her mother. Her words were meaningless, but they achieved the result she was striving for. The countess, sobbing heavily, hid her face on her daughter's breast, and Nikolai got up, clutched his head, and left the room. Natasha took up the cause of reconciliation and brought it up to a point where Nikolai obtained his mother's promise that Sonia would not be oppressed, and promised himself that he would not undertake anything in secret from his parents. With the firm intention of settling his affairs in the regiment, resigning from the service, coming home and marrying Sonia. Nikolai, sad and serious and in discord with his family, but as it seemed to him passionately in love, left for his regiment at the beginning of January. After Nikolai's departure, the Rostovs' house became sadder than ever. The countess was so emotionally upset that she fell ill. Sonia grieved both at being parted from Nikolai and still more at the hostile tone with which the countess could not help treating her. The count was more preoccupied than ever with the bad state of his affairs, which called for some decisive measures. It was necessary to sell the Moscow house and nearby estate, and to sell the house it was necessary to go to Moscow. But because of the countess's health, they had to put off the departure from day to day. Natasha, who had been mourned the initial time of her separation from her fiancé lightly and even cheerfully, now grew more and more troubled and impatient with every day. The thought that her time, which she could have used in loving him, was being wasted like that, for nothing, tormented her unremittingly. His letters mostly made her angry. It offended her to think that, while she lived only by the thoughts of him, he was living a real life, seeing new places and new people who interested him. The more diverting his letters were, the more vexed she felt. Her own letters to him not only did not furnish her with any comfort, but were boring and false duty. She was unable to write because she could not conceive the possibility of truthfully expressing in letter even a thousandth part of what she was used to expressing with her voice. Smile and gaze. She wrote him classically monotonous, dry letters to which she herself did not ascribe any significance, and in the drafts of which the countess corrected the spelling errors. The countess' health still did not improve, but it was no longer possible to put off the trip to Moscow. A dowry had to be prepared, the house had to be sold, and besides, Prince Andrei was first expected in Moscow, where Prince Nikolai Andreevich was spending that winter, and Natasha was sure that he had already arrived. The countess stayed in the country, and the count, taking Sonia and Natasha with him, went to Moscow at the end of January. Part 5, Chapter 1. After the engagement of Prince Andrei and Natasha, Pierre, without any obvious reason, suddenly felt the impossibility of going on with his former life. However firmly convinced he was on the truths revealed to him by his benefactor, however joyful for him had been that first time of enthusiastic inner work of self-improvement, to which he had given himself with such an ardor. After Prince Andrei's betrothal to Natasha, and after the death of Losif Alevich, of which he received news at almost the same time, the whole charm of that former life suddenly vanished for him. Only the skeleton of life remained, his house with his brilliant wife, who now enjoyed the favors of an important person, acquaintance with all Petersburg, and service with its full formalities. And that former life suddenly presented itself to Pierre with unexpected vileness. He ceased writing in his diary, avoided the company of the brothers, began going to the club again, began drinking heavily again, became close again with bachelor companies, and began leading such a life that Elena Vasilievna felt it necessary to reprimand him sternly. Pierre felt that she was right, and, to avoid compromising his wife, left for Moscow. In Moscow, as soon as he moved into his huge house with the dried and drying up princesses, with its enormous staff as soon as he saw, on driving through the day, the Arvayska chapel, with countless candles burning before the cold casing, saw the Kremlin Square with its untrampled snow, the cabbies, the hovels of the Sistav Veshchas, sold old Moscow men who desired nothing and were not hurrying anywhere as they lived out their lives. Saw little old women, Moscow ladies, Moscow balls, and the Moscow English Club. He felt himself at home in a quiet haven. For him, Moscow was uncomfortable, warm, habitual, and dirty, like an old dressing ground. All Moscow society, from old women to children, received Pierre like a long-awaited guest, whose place was always kept ready and vacant. For Moscow society, Pierre was the most dear, kind, intelligent, merry, and magnanimous of eccentrics, absent-minded and warm-hearted, a Russian squire of the old stamp. His purse was always empty. It was open to everyone. Benefit performances, bad paintings and statues, philanthropic societies, gypsies, schools, subscription dinners, carousing, the Masons, church, books. No one and nothing met with refusal, and had it not been for two friends of his, who had borrowed a good deal of money from him and taken him under their tutelage, he would have given everything away. No evening or dinner at the club would do without him. As soon as he dropped into his place on the sofa after 2 bottles of Margox, he was surrounded, and the talk, arguments, and jokes began. Where people quarreled, he merely, but by his kindly smile and appropriately uttered joke, made peace. Dinners at the Masonic lodges were dull and sluggish if he was not there. When, after a bachelor supper, with a sweet and kindly smile yielding to the entreaties of the merry company, he got up to go with them, joyful, triumphant, cries came from the young men. At balls he danced, if there was a need for partners. The young ladies and girls liked him, because without paying court to anyone, he was equally amiable with them all, especially after supper. Ilst charmant, na para de sex, they said of him. Pierre was one of those retired gentlemen in waiting of whom there were hundreds good-naturedly living out their lives in Moscow. How horrified he would have been if 7 years ago, when he had just come from abroad, someone had told him that there was no need to seek or invent anything, that his rut had long been carved out for him and determined from all eternity, and that, however he twisted and turned, he would be that which everybody was in his position. He could not have believed it. He had not watched all his soul to establish a republic in Russia, then to become a Napoleon himself, a philosopher, a tactician, the defeater of Napoleon. Had he not seen the possibility and passionately wished to transform depraved mankind and bring his own self to the highest degree of perfection? Had he not established schools and hospitals and liberated his peasants? But instead of all that, here he was, the rich husband of an unfaithful wife, a retired gentleman in waiting who liked to eat, drink, and unbuttoning himself to denounce the government a little, a member of the Moscow English Club, and universally beloved member of Moscow society. For a long time he could not reconcile himself to the thought that he was not the very same retired Moscow gentleman in waiting, the type which he had so deeply despised 7 years ago. He sometimes comforted himself with the thought that he had happened to be leading this life just so, in the meantime. But then he would be horrified by another thought, that it was just so, in the meantime, that so many people had entered his life, this club, as he had, with all their teeth and hair come out of it, with not a single tooth or hair left. In moments of pride, when he thought of his position, it seemed to him that he was quite different, distinct from those retired gentlemen in waiting whom he had formerly despised, that they were banal and stupid, content, and at peace in their position. Why, I'm not all content even now, and keep wanting to do something for mankind, he said to himself in a moment of pride. And maybe all these comrades of mine struggle like me, sought some new path of their own life, just like me. By force of circumstance, society, breeding, by that elemental force against which man is powerless, were brought to where I am now. He said to himself in moments of modesty, and having lived in Moscow for a time, he no longer despised, but was beginning to love, respect, and pity his comrades in fate as he did himself. Pierre was not, as formerly, overcome by moments of despair, spleen, and loathing for life, but the same illness that formerly expressed itself in abrupt fits were now driven inside and never left him for a moment. What for? Why? What's going on in the world? He asked himself with perplexity several times a day, involuntarily beginning to ponder the meaning of life's phenomenon. But knowing from experience that there were no answers to these questions, he hastily attempted to turn away from them, picked up the book, and hurried off to the club or to Apollo Nikolaitch's to chat about the gossip of the town. Elena Vasilievna, who had never loved anything except her own body, and is one of the stupidest women in the world, thought Pierre, appears to people at the height of intelligence and finesse, and now they bow down to her. Napoleon Bonaparte was scorned by everyone as long as he was great, but now that he's become a pathetic comedian, the Emperor Franz seeks to offer him his daughter as an illegitimate wife. The Spanish offer up prayers to God through the Catholic clergy in thanksgiving for having defeated the French on the 14th of June, and the French offers up prayers to the same Catholic clergy for having defeated the Spanish on the 14th of June. My brother Masons swear in blood that they are ready to sacrifice everything for thy neighbor, but they won't pay a single ruble in the collection for the poor, and have Austria intrigue against the Mana Sikas, and fuss over an authentic Scottish rug and about charters, the meaning of which is unknown even to those who write them, which nobly needs. With all confess the Christian law of forgiveness of offense and love one's neighbor, a law in consequence in which we have erected 40 times 40 churches in Moscow. But yesterday a deserter was flogged to death, and a priest, a servant of that same law of love and forgiveness, gave him the cross to kiss before the execution. So Pierre reflected, and accustomed as he was to it, this whole general, universally acknowledged lie amazed him each time like something new. I understand this lie and confusion, he thought, but how can I tell them all that I understand it? I've tried, and have always found that in the depths of their souls they understand the same thing I do, but they simply try not to see it. Therefore, it must be so. But I, what am I to do with myself? Pierre thought. He experienced the unfortunate ability of many people, especially Russians, the ability to see and believe in the possibility of goodness. And in truth, to see the evil and falsehood of life too, clearly to be able to participate in it seriously. Every sphere of work was, in his eyes, bound up with evil and deceit. Whatever he tried to be, whatever he undertook, evil and falsehood repulsed him and barred him from all paths of activity. And yet he had to live. He had to keep busy. It was too frightening to be under the burden of the insolent questions of life, and he gave himself to the first amusements that came along, only so as to forget them. He frequented every possible society, drank heavily, bought paintings, built, but above all, he read. He read everything that came to hand, so that on coming home, while the footmen were still undressing him, he would take up a book and read, and from reading he would pass into sleep, and from sleep to chatter in drawing rooms and the clubs, from chatter to carousing and women, from carousing back to chatter, reading, and wine. Drinking wine became more of a physical and at the same time moral need for him, though the doctors told him that, with his corpulence, wine was dangerous for him. He drank a great deal. He felt perfectly well only when, without noticing how, having poured several glasses of wine into his large mouth, he experienced a pleasant warmth in his body, an affection towards all his neighbors, and a mental readiness to respond superficially to every thought, without going deeply into its essence. Only when he had drunk a bottle or two of wine did he become dimly aware that the tangled, terrible knot of life, which had formerly terrified him, was not frightening as it seemed to him. With a buzzing in his head, charting, listening, to conversation, or reading after dinner and supper, he constantly saw that knot from some sort of his sides. But under the influence of wine, did he say to himself, "Never mind, I'll disentangle it. I've got a ready explanation right here, but I have no time now. I'll think it all over later." But this later never came. On an empty stomach in the morning, an old question seemed as insoluble and frightening as ever, and Pierre would hastily seize a book and was glad when somebody came to see him. Sometimes Pierre remembered stories he had heard about how soldiers at war, taking cover under enemy fire when there was nothing to do, try to find some occupation for themselves as to endure the danger more easily. And to Pierre, all people seemed to be such soldiers, saving themselves from life. Some with ambition, some with cards, some with drafting laws, some with women, some with playthings, some with horses, some with politics, some with hunting, some with wine, some with affairs of states. Nothing is either trivial or important. It's all the same. Only save yourself from it as best as you can, thought Pierre. Only not to see it, that dreadful it. And I'm going to leave it off there. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you like it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. And I'll be back and do another video. So take care and see you later.